Hello, I'm Robert Moynihan, the editor of Inside the Vatican magazine, with Matt Gaspers, my colleague. And we have the great honor today, on Tuesday, September 10th, 2024, of turning our attention to China with one of the great experts we have in the United States today on the question of China, Steve Mosher. Steve, great to have you with us.
It's good to be with you, Bob and Matt.
So we're
Yes.
turning our attention to the East. China is a great country, an enormous country, and an ancient country. The Vatican has made an agreement with China in 2018, 2-year annual agreement that's been repeated in 2020 and 2022, and now it's expected to be agreed again in 2024. So for the Vatican, China is an important country, but people have criticized the Vatican for making an agreement with the communist government in China. So this will be among the topics we'll discuss today, and I wanted to start with that. How do you view this Vatican agreement with China, Steve?
Well, I have something of a history here because I was invited by Cardinal Pietro Parolin in the summer of 2018 to meet with him to discuss an agreement with China. I spent an hour with the Cardinal, who is in charge of the Vatican's of the Secretariat, foreign relations, basically. And he asked me my opinion on reaching an agreement with China. I said, well, first of all, you need to know that China, the Chinese Communist Party, will violate any agreement that you sign with them because they violated a whole slew of agreements, international agreements they've signed in the past. So there's no chance, I believe, they will honor this if they think that it will not serve their purposes. And their purposes, I told the good cardinal, were to eventually crush the Catholic Church in China. It was not to allow them a breathing space. It was not to give them living space. It was not to acknowledge their existence, but to create a structure under the terms of which the Vatican would be put in a position of seeming to pressure members of the underground church, bishops, priests, and the laity into joining the official Catholic Patriotic Association, which is, by the way, still in schism. It has never not been in schism. It is run by the Chinese Communist Party. And the other thing I pointed out to him was that the Chinese Communist Party had recently, and this is 2018, recently in 2018, taken control of the surveillance and monitoring of religious activities in China was formerly done by the Bureau of Religious Affairs in the People's Government of Beijing. And shortly before the signing of the Sino-British Agreement, that control was removed from the government and put in the hands of the party's United Front Department. Why is that significant? Because the United Front Department is one of the three magic weapons used by the Chinese Communist Party to defeat their enemies. Those three magic weapons, first enunciated by Chairman Mao and repeated recently by the current dictator of China, Xi Jinping, were propaganda, the People's Liberation Army, and United Front tactics, which means that you go in, you co-opt, you infiltrate, you co-opt and control organizations that may initially be working against the purposes of the party, but you burrow within them and transform them into organizations that serve the interests of the party. I said, so clearly the goal of the Chinese Communist Party is to infiltrate even more the Catholic Church in China and turn the Catholic Church to its own purposes, which are fundamentally at odds with the purposes of the one holy and apostolic Catholic Church, which is to convert souls and get them home to heaven. The Chinese Communist Party, of course, is officially atheistic, rejects the notion of the hereafter, focuses on the here and now, and simply sees the Catholic Patriotic Association as a means of controlling the people of China, including the Catholics of China. Now, needless to say, Bob, my advice was ignored because when I finished with my presentation, Cardinal Parolin looked at me and said, well, the agreement's already been negotiated. We're just waiting for the Chinese side to sign. All right. So my heart fell at that point because I knew that it was basically a done deal.
Well, that's very significant, everything you've just said. The fact that you were called in the fact they consulted, the fact that they did so having already made the decision, the fact that it was 2018, now we're 2024, 6 years. The Vatican re-signed in 2020 and 2022, so twice. It looks like they're going to re-sign again. They must feel they get some advantage, unless you would take them to be complicit with the Chinese government in some way and not really interested in the Catholic Church, which would mean that they were somehow infiltrating into the Vatican itself, a kind of mentality that's not Catholic. But they must feel they get some type of advantage by having a space for the church. Is there no advantage for the church to have this agreement?
Well, first of all, let me say that I am not sure, even 6 years after the supposed initial signing of the agreement, that there is actually an agreement in place. And I'm going by the words of Cardinal Parolin, who said last June, when he was asked, why can't the secret agreement, the terms of the secret agreement, be made public? Why is there such a lack of transparency? And he said, and I quote, that it's because it is still a work in progress. It is still a working document. Now, I've spent most of my adult life studying China. And I will guarantee you that there's only one person in China who would dare authorize the signing of what is, in effect, an international treaty, a treaty between China and a foreign power, which is how the Chinese Communist Party views the Vatican, as a foreign power. And that one person is the dictator Xi Jinping. No other Chinese official would dare to put his signature on an agreement with a foreign power, because it would be equivalent, tantamount to putting a bullseye on his chest, a target on his back, opening him up to criticism inside party circles. You signed an agreement with this imperialistic power, which wants to convert Chinese away from their faith in the party into faith in God. How dare you? So I'm not sure that the agreement has ever been signed by China. And I believe the Vatican has, these past 6 years, been operating on a hope and a prayer. Now, I think hope is a wonderful thing. It's a virtue. And I recommend prayer to everybody. But I don't see the tangible results of this agreement, which has been extended again and again in 2020 and 2022, and may be extended again very shortly. Remember that it wasn't very long ago that the Chinese Communist Party, without consulting the Vatican at all, installed a new Bishop of Shanghai, Bishop Joseph Shenbin. Okay, the agreement was supposed to concern, as we're told, the appointment and the consecration of bishops. This appointment was made without the Vatican being consulted. And even sources in the Vatican at the time, you will recall, Bob, were saying that they've broken the agreement. They've broken the agreement.
Yeah.
So that's how I think about the so-called working document that the Vatican is operating on, hoping that if they show enough goodwill, if they simply give China, the Chinese Communist Party, enough time, that the Chinese Communist Party will somehow, within its heart, find the good grace to respond in kind. I don't think they ever will. I think that the Vatican fundamentally misunderstands the atheistic, diabolical nature of the Chinese Communist Party, and you can be as servile and as forgiving and as loving as you want towards the Chinese Communist Party as an institution, and it will not reciprocate in kind, ever.
Well, Matt, what do you think?
Well, I think Steve has given a very good summary of everything, and someone did ask in the comments for just kind of a brief explanation of the nature of the agreement, which Steve mentioned it's about the appointment of bishops, because roughly how many sees in China, I know you've talked about this before, Steve, but there are many sees in China that officially do not even have a bishop currently. Is that right?
That's right. And one of the hopes of the Vatican going into this agreement was that the 40 empty sees in China would be filled by bishops that the Chinese Communist Party and the Pope could jointly agree upon. And let me go back here and say that the initial negotiating position on the part of the Vatican back 15 years ago was to say, well, let's use the Vietnamese model for an agreement between China and the Vatican. The Vietnamese model is very interesting because the Chinese Communist Party, the Communist Party of Vietnam, not the Chinese Communist Party, but the people in charge of Vietnam agreed to do this with the Vatican. They agreed that the Vatican and the Vietnamese government, the Hanoi regime, would jointly select 3 candidates for any empty see. And those 3 candidates would be jointly nominated by both the Vatican and Hanoi. And then the Pope would be free to choose any one of the 3. Now, I believe that that formula, while not perfect, preserves the authority of the Pope to name the bishops. Mm-hmm. When it was proposed to the Chinese Communist Party that that model be used, the Chinese Communist Party said, absolutely not. We will nominate our candidates, and you will either approve them or not. But you cannot simply continue to veto candidates, one senior Chinese official said. You cannot continue to refuse to accept our candidates because we will simply appoint them anyway if you continue to try to exercise this veto power. Mm-hmm. So that's the current situation. I believe that the Chinese Communist Party nominates someone and the Pope has a kind of temporary veto over the process. And maybe he can reject a candidate or two, but he knows in the end that the Communist Party will appoint whomever they want.
And I think something else significant that we should mention here is we know from the testimony of Archbishop Vigano from 2018, September of 2018, that former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick was part of this hatching of this deal as well, right?
We do know that now laicized Theodore McCarrick was the emissary of the Pope on several trips to China, during the course of which he was fundamental in negotiating this agreement. And we actually have his personal correspondence between McCarrick and Pope Francis at one point in that correspondence, which was revealed by the former cardinal's former secretary in Rome. Cardinal McCarrick said that he intended to fulfill the ancient dream of Matteo Ricci, the great Catholic missionary to China of centuries ago. He said, I hope to fulfill the ancient dream of Matteo Ricci and bring you China, which is kind of a grandiose proclamation. And I think in the event, I think what Theodore McCarrick may have achieved is to bring the underground Catholic Church to the Chinese Communist Party on a silver platter.
Well, this is all very interesting. I knew McCarrick. He's still alive. I know Vigano. I know Paroline. And there's a journalist in Rome who had a long conversation with me one night about 10 years ago saying Pope Francis' greatest dream is to fulfill the mission of Matteo Ricci, the Jesuit who went to China in the 1500s, became a Mandarin, learned Chinese, and then was actually highly respected by the imperial court, as I understand it.
Yes.
And started to think that he could make inroads in a sense of converting some leading Chinese and starting a church in China. And he wrote to Rome and he said, I'd like to have one little permission to not have everything entirely in Latin. Let's use the Chinese language. This will help. And Rome wrote back and said, no, continue to use the Latin because this unifies and solidifies the doctrine and the unity of the church. And Matteo Ricci didn't get too far, but there was a church in China. And I don't really know the history, but I know that when I was a young man, we were always talking about the underground church in China that had been born decades and maybe centuries ago, but bit by bit, finally when the Chinese communist regime came in, it was entirely suppressed and repressed. And if you were a member of the underground Catholic Church in China, and the Vatican cut off all relations with the communist government in the 1950s, there were no nuncios or embassies. And the church remained, and it had some 5 million people who were part of it, apparently. and people were ordained priests underground, and they met in their homes, and they didn't. Do you know about that period and how bitter was the persecution of the church?
Well, of course, as a China scholar, every China scholar knows about the great Jesuit Matteo Ricci,
Yeah,
who went to China and had a unique gift of languages. In fact, he had an eidetic memory. He had a perfect memory. And he could read a Chinese text once and then recite it verbatim
amazing.
for
Wow.
it was a remarkable photographic memory. It was a gift that took him instantly into the highest circles of Confucian society in ancient China, because you got to be promoted in the ranks of officialdom in China by passing tests which tested your memory of the Confucian classics. You had to be able to recite uh, verbatim, by memory, without missing a beat, the works of Confucius, the works of Mencius, the works of Daozi and others, and Lao Tzu, and he could do that. And so he was instantly admitted to the upper reaches of Confucian officialdom, and he actually made a number of converts among officials in China during the latter days of the Ming Dynasty. And the second to the last emperor of the Ming Dynasty actually attended Mass 16 times in the North Cathedral in Beijing, which was built at that time, an early version of it. And he actually called the priest their father, which was unheard of in Confucianism, because the emperor was supposed to be the father to his people, and the emperor would never call anyone father. And yet he apparently was very close to being converted and called the presiding priest of the masses he attended father. So I think a historic opportunity was lost there to convert China in the same way that Armenia was converted, for example, in the early centuries of Christianity. And it was forestalled by what? It was forestalled by the Manchu invasion, which toppled the Ming Dynasty. Anyway, a little history there.
No, that was helpful. Thank you.
Jumping forward to the persecution under the Chinese Communist Party was the most vicious persecution that was ever carried out and is still being carried out against any religion in Chinese history. There were periods when the Confucian elite did not welcome what it considered to be foreign religions. But when the Chinese Communist Party first began to operate in the Qinghai Mountains after Mao Zedong established the first red base, they instantly went after the priests and the local churches. They would take over the local churches because the local churches in the villages and towns were the best constructed buildings in the entire area. And so they would use those as their headquarters. They would send the local priest, if there was one, packing. And so there was persecution. The first missionary was killed by the communists, I think, in 1929. And there was a steady death toll among foreign missionaries and domestic Catholics throughout the period of the Revolutionary War. And that intensified in 1949 once the Chinese Communist Party seized control of all of China. I'm actually writing another book about the history of Chinese martyrs in China under communism, and the list is long. Most of the martyrs, we will never know their names until we get to heaven and find out. But there were many Catholics who were martyred over the years in defense of their faith against a rabidly atheistic Chinese Communist Party, which was not merely atheistic, but aspired to be all things to all people. You see, communism in its most aggressive manifestation is a quasi-religion, as you know, and they expect that their leader to be worshipped as a kind of demigod, and they expect the Communist Party members to be regarded as priests in this new religion, and the people are expected to be docile pew sitters in the new Church of China. which is the church that the Chinese Communist Party established and wants to run. And so no other religions are really welcome within this Church of China, which promotes an ultra patriotism, which is intended to cement loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. And but nonetheless, despite all of the persecution, the church survived. It survived during the Cultural Revolution, when churches were being torn down by the hundreds and when Catholics were being martyred. And it thrived after Deng Xiaoping came to power, after the death of Mao in 1976. It took Deng Xiaoping a couple of years to get back out of exile and then internal exile and then seize power in 1978. And he declared a general amnesty. And that's when Bishop Kong and all the other political prisoners, including Catholics, were released. The ones who had survived, many died because of mistreatment, because they were starved to death, tortured to death. But there was a general amnesty. And in the 80s and up until the 90s, there was a period of relative openness in China where Catholics were free to rebuild their churches. I know that because I actually funded the rebuilding of a couple of churches in China that had been destroyed earlier by the communists, by the Red Guards. We were able to do things like open orphanages in China for all of the little girl children who were being abandoned by their parents because of the one-child policy. Parents wanted sons. They had a daughter. They would not be allowed to have a second child and have a son. So many of them would abandon their little girls. We opened orphanages in China. It was possible to do that during that period of relative openness. And I'll never forget a meeting I had in 1996 with Cardinal Filoni, who was then the papal nuncio to China.
Yeah.
And I said, what he was not based in Beijing, obviously, because there are no diplomatic relations there. The nuncio office, the nunciatura, was based in Hong Kong, which is where I met him. And I said, what's your opinion of the state of the church in China? And he said, well, the church in China is unified. He said, all of the bishops of China have come to us, by us he meant the Vatican, and asked to be recognized as legitimate bishops. And he said, after investigation, we have recognized them all. The only ones we didn't recognize were the bishops of Shanghai, appointed by the communists, and the Bishop of Beijing, appointed by the communists. He said they've made too many compromises with the Chinese Communist Party. But as for the rest, we've all recognized them in pectore as valid bishops. And so he said the church is basically united. That's a wonderful thing to hear for me as a Catholic. Things have been downhill ever since. You can't run an orphanages in China now, at least a foreigner can't, foreign Catholic organization can't. You can't build churches in China today. The church is under tremendous pressure because Xi Jinping is the son, not of his loins, but the son of the spirit of Mao Zedong. And he is absolutely determined to crush all religions in China, Catholic, Christian, Muslim, you name it.
Well, okay, I do have some thoughts because there was an argument made that Francis thought, by making such an agreement, that there could be a small hole opened up, that some light of the transcendent, we might call it the light of the holy or the light of the Logos, the light of Christ, would reach into China and not be completely suppressed. And you're saying this regime does wish to completely suppress it. So by having some agreement, they could protect it, and that the human spirit longs for something transcendent, and Chinese communism doesn't offer that, and that if they could see it coming in, this light of the eternal, we might call it, the eternal God, this could spark a fire of conversion and of faith that the Chinese government wouldn't expect, because they would underestimate the longing that the human person, even though it seems content with materialism, actually desires the infinite. And therefore, making this agreement might launch a spark, which then in a certain moment would have 100 or 200 million Chinese, or more, say, we don't want an entirely materialistic regime. And this in the perspective of everything that's happened with Confucianism being overturned, I don't know how the Chinese mandarins and leadership class could have entirely abandoned their ancient Confucian tradition and embraced Marxist Leninism. And they had their cultural revolution where they took Ming vases that had been made in the 1700s and are valued at millions of dollars. And they said, you're a member of the upper class, you're not united with the workers. We're taking your vases and your children and everywhere, throwing them in the street, destroyed them. But this was not against just that upper class. This was against China itself, its whole tradition of culture being a highly developed culture, which did involve that Confucian faith, but also artistic and literary and other behavior. And I look at this in the context. I once read a story about the Taiping Rebellion. And there was a man leading that rebellion who thought that he was in some way a representative of Jesus Christ. And starting in this was the 1860s, 1870s, and he actually took Nanking, as far as I recall. And then the Chinese government was weak at that time. The American, German, British, and French colonial regimes were going all over the world, particularly in Africa, but also in Asia. And they divided China into 4 trade zones. And then there was the Boxer Rebellion. We were selling opium to the Chinese. There were opium dens. And Chinese leadership, including this last emperor, the boy emperor of China, couldn't control anything. China was on its knees, as it were. It was humiliated. Then they had people like Sun Yat-sen, who actually I think came to Hartford, Connecticut, and studied, and then went back and became the first president of a kind of post-imperial China, modern state. But then suddenly there was a First World War, and the 20s came, and warlords sprang up in China. And out of that mess, and then Japan in the 30s came in and took all of Manchuria. Out of that mess with no central powerful leadership, they turned finally to this Mao Zedong and the communist leadership. But it was a sort of late imposition on China. The true spirit of China cannot, I don't think, forever embrace communism. And I think the leaders must know this deep in their hearts. Now, maybe I've said crazy things. How do you think of this idea that you could open up a channel towards a spiritual realm that could be Catholic in China while remaining both Chinese and Catholic by having such an agreement, and that the Pope would then go down as the one who fulfilled the dream of Matteo Ricci?
Well, far be it from me to doubt the working of the Holy Spirit. I'm just looking, much of which occurs, beyond the realm of the that we're able to perceive. It's imperceivable. But speaking just about the Chinese Communist Party itself and its founder, Mao Zedong, and I write about this in detail, as in my book, The Devil in Communist China. There were always in Chinese history 2 different theories of government, 2 different political philosophies in play. And one was Confucianism. And Confucianism is the idea that you rule by persuasion, you rule by moral suasion. The emperor is the father of his people. Social order is maintained by the 5 relationships, the 5 relationships being the relationship between emperor and his people, his children, between husband and wife, between older brother and younger brother, between student and teacher, and so on. And those 5 relationships, if everyone abides by those relationships, if husbands are obedient to their wives and older brothers are listened to by their younger brothers, and everyone listens to the emperor, you have peace and harmony throughout the empire. Well, that's a nice idea. In practice, however, it didn't always work, and the emperors also relied upon legalism. And legalism was a sort of proto-totalitarianism. Legalism was created by an ancient school of philosophy that few people have heard about called legalism. And the legalists proposed that the king of ancient China who wanted to become emperor would do these things. He would have a standing army. He would control the production of steel because with steel you can make weapons. He would control the production and distribution of salt because people need salt to live as an essential part of their diet. He would have he would promote legalist philosophy, and he would burn the books of competing philosophies. He would promote legalist scholars, and he would kill Confucian and Mencius followers. He would have a song and dance troops going around the empire, singing his praises, creating a cult of personality. He would have concentration camps, and the concentration camps actually were those that built the great canals and the first iteration of the Great Wall. So all of the things we associate with modern totalitarianism and modern Marxist-Leninism were actually found in China hundreds of years before the birth of Christ. And the first emperor of the Qin dynasty, from which we get the word China, Qin, China, Qin Shi Huangdi, he's called the first emperor of the Qing dynasty, was an absolutely committed legalist. He had all of the things that I mentioned. He had the concentration camps, the propaganda troops. He had political commissars in the military to watch over the generals. He had a standing army. He didn't allow ordinary people to have weapons, and so on and so forth. And he was able, using the legalist practical political skills, I guess you want to call them, he was able to conquer all of China in 220 BC and unify the country for the first time. Now, after that, the emperor sort of moved back and forth between Confucianism and legalism. And you can accurately say, as many people have, that Chinese political culture was Confucian on the outside and legalist on the inside. On the outside, looking at it from abroad, as we do, you see only the silken costume of Confucianism. You see the Confucian scholars. You see the exams to join officialdom. And you think, well, that's not a bad system of government. But if you look inside the system, you will see underneath the silken costume of Confucianism is the iron scaffolding of legalism, which says things like, you must have 10 punishments for every reward. You must, if someone betrays the emperor, kill not just him, but his entire family out to 5 generations, and so on and so forth. So that was the choice that Sun Yat-sen and Mao Zedong both faced. Sun Yat-sen chose Confucianism, and he went to the United States. He was in Hawaii for many years. He was a great admirer of U.S. democracy, and he actually wrote his constitution model on the U.S. Constitution. So it was Confucianism blended with Western democracy. Mao, on the other hand, rejected Confucianism, saw legalism as the means by which China had first been unified, and seized upon that. But legalism, of course, was 2,000 years old. But wait, in the 1920s, there was a new philosophy called communism that in many respects was like legalism. And so it appealed to this young, ambitious man who, I must say, was one of the most immoral men in human history. Mao, as a young man, said, quote, "There are other people and things in the world, but they're only there for my use and my pleasure."
Well,
As a young man said, "I am godless and lawless." And of course, that makes sense, because if you don't have God, you tend to be lawless. You tend to abandon morality.
I mean, we're talking here about power. And
Yes.
we're talking here also about the desire of the West, which itself is now in a corrupt state, which we're going to get to in just a moment. But and Matt has prepared some slides on these matters. But what I want to say is, in 1972, Richard Nixon went to China to a ping pong tournament of some sort. And a friend of mine who was sort of a mentor to me, who became the ambassador of Ronald Reagan to the Vatican, whose name was Frank Shakespeare.
I knew, Ambassador Shakespeare well.
And I've talked about some of these matters many times with Frank. We even traveled in Russia together, and he's passed away just a year and a half ago. But Frank was there in 1972 at that opening to China. And American business said, well, we can employ someone for 10 cents. We're paying $30 an hour in America. We'll move all our industry to China. And in some ways, that opening to China was a double thing. It thought China might open toward democracy, apparently, I guess. And then it thought that they could globalize production and raise China, which I think was still almost a medieval country at that time, although they'd already had 20 years of making iron and things in local foundries, but it was a very poor country. So Nixon and Frank Shakespeare and others made a massive change and involved China in the global economic system, but thinking that Western democracy could somehow emerge in China through the use of the market, etc. And it's almost the same naive idea that Cardinal Parolin and perhaps Pope Francis have with making this Vatican agreement with China. Can China evolve into a democratic country, or is the entire effort folly?
Well, I would never rule out divine intervention in human affairs. It happens all the time, after all. But I must tell you that the Chinese Communist Party has made a study of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It has made a study of the influence of the Catholic Church, especially in Poland, but also in other Eastern European countries, and the role that the Catholic Church played in the creation of solidarity, where the workers were actually meeting in Catholic churches to talk about overthrowing the communist regime, and were ultimately successful. And they see the Catholic Church as a potential threat to their rule, and they are determined to control its every activity. And you see in the speech that the new dictator, Xi Jinping, I won't call him president because there are no free elections in China. He is the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. He's the chairman of the Central Military Commission. He's not a president in the sense that we have presidents. He gave a speech on religion several years ago, in which he made very clear that all activity and all religious activity should serve the interests of the party, should help to foster allegiance to the party and loyalty to the party's leaders, by which he meant he himself. So again, going back to the point of the Communist Party wanting to co-opt religious organizations, ones that they can't choke out overnight, they want to co-opt and control and use for their own purposes. That's why, for example, they want to be in charge of appointing the next Dalai Lama so they can control Tibetan Buddhism and gradually use it as an instrument to promote communist ideology and empty it of its any vestiges of the traditional Tibetan Buddhist faith.
Well,
That's why in the Catholic Church they're proposing a new Bible that they have rewritten that fundamentally changes a number of passages in Scripture. That's why they have forbidden the sale of Bibles that conform to the canon, and they're doing all sorts of things along those lines to co-opt and control the church. So I don't see the light yet. Hopefully, the light will dawn, Bob. But right now,
well, okay. The other side of the point is, even in the United States, that you say they want to control the Dalai Lama, but it seems they want to control also the election of our own president.
Yes, we will be getting to that shortly. Before we go on, I did want to share the screen here and show people where to find Steve's latest book, published earlier this year by Tan Books, The Devil in Communist China from Mao down to Z. I have read the book earlier this year, and I had the opportunity to interview Steve about it. It's a great read, so I highly recommend checking it out. So the main catalyst for our discussion today is this news that came out a couple weeks ago. I'm going to put it up on the screen here. The Holy See announced 2 weeks ago today. It says the Holy See has learned with satisfaction that today, August 27th, Bishop Melchior Shi Hongzhen has been officially recognized under civil law as Bishop of Tianjin in China. This measure, the Vatican says, is a positive fruit of the dialogue established over the years between the Holy See and the Chinese government. And then the second paragraph is a little biographical information about the bishop that we're discussing, this man here. who was born in 1929. He's 95 years old. He was ordained in 1954, ordained a priest, consecrated coadjutor bishop of Tianjin in 1982, meaning that he would be the next in line, like he has guaranteed succession when the incumbent bishop passed away. And he is the one who the CCP has now recognized as the Bishop of Tianjin. So last week, I think it was, I corresponded with Steve because I came across two articles regarding this. One was by the Ed Condon at the Pillar, which is kind of a more optimistic interpretation of this news. And then I also, when I sent that to Steve and said, "Did you hear about this?" And of course, he had heard about it and already posted about it. And Steve tweeted out this other article from Asia News, which probably gives a more realistic take on things. So just to read a couple paragraphs from the Pillar article, it says, with the Vatican's agreement with Beijing on episcopal appointments set for renewal in October, Xi's recognition by the state has been hailed by some China watchers as a sign of real progress for the Holy See. And obviously that's the Holy See's opinion as well. Condon goes on to say, in fact, Xi's acceptance as a bishop by state authorities, and crucially, his acceptance of a formula for accepting state recognition, could provide a template for resolving an impasse which has plagued Vatican-China relations since 2018 and kept dozens of bishops underground and subject to state harassment. But what Steve tweeted out is that in exchange for recognition, Bishop Xi was forced to, quote, solemnly swear to always adhere to the direction of the Sinicization of Catholicism in China. And he also mentioned that according to Xi Jinping, Sinicization means that all religious communities should be led by the party, controlled by the party, and support the party. So what is your take on this news that Bishop Xi has been recognized by the Chinese Communist Party, Mr. Mosher?
Well, we talked early on about how Matteo Ricci was trying to achieve what we call enculturation, which is recognizing and accepting aspects of the culture that you find yourself in as a missionary, which promote and enhance, or at least do not conflict with, the tenets of the Catholic faith. And so we have beautiful churches in China built with using Chinese architectural principles, for example, and other things which are properly understood as enculturation. But Sinicization is not enculturation. Sinicization, in the definition used by the Chinese Communist Party, means that any organization will serve the interest of the party and its promote the party line and teach respect for the party's leaders. That's what Sinicization means. And so I would just invite people to look at the picture of Bishop Melchior Xi and ask yourself, does he look happy about this development? And in my reading of his face, he looks solemn and sad, because this is a man who for decades has been punished by the Chinese Communist Party, kept in virtual isolation in a small village outside of the metropolis of Tianjin, allowed very few visitors, kept under watch, basically house arrest. For what? For refusing to join the Catholic Patriotic Association and swear allegiance to the party. Now, he has just been forced in a way to swear allegiance to the party. And the other thing I would say is that that if this were a truly pivotal moment in the history of the Sino-Vatican Agreement, a relaxation of the strict controls of the Chinese Communist Party is placing over the church in China, a successor bishop would have been named at the same time. After all, Bishop Xi is 95 years old. He will not be with us very much longer. So who is going to take his place? Why hasn't the Vatican and the Chinese Communist Party reached an agreement on who his successor would be. That, I think, would be a real proof that the Holy Spirit is moving in China, as we all hope it will be.
And I guess my question is, at 95 years old and after resisting so heroically for so many decades, it's very curious that he's all of a sudden decided to go along with this. I wonder if there was pressure being exerted from perhaps even from people at the Vatican. That, I guess that's my question.
Well, in 2018, he was visited by Vatican officials who gave him a pectoral cross, and I believe probably quietly urged him to do precisely what he just did, and that is craft an oath that was pleasing to the Chinese Communist Party, swear by it, and then be publicly recognized as the bishop of Tianjin. And I think after that visit, he still resisted for 6 years. I find it hard to believe that that this was entirely voluntary. It certainly does seem to be, to me, as a China watcher, a way for the Chinese Communist Party to give the Vatican a reason, one might say an excuse, to continue to be tolerant of the other evidence of persecution and oppression of the church in China and extend the agreement for another 2 years.
Well, why does Condon regard this as a very big deal, or possibly could be a very big deal?
I hope springs eternal. I can't be sanguine about the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping.
Okay.
And the devil in communist China. I detail in the book. There's a chapter on Xi Jinping, and he is emulating Mao Zedong, who is one of the most evil men in human history in all respects, including his dislike, his even his hatred of all religions in China, except the quasi-religion propagated by the Chinese Communist Party. He is forbidding the teaching of Mongolian to elementary school students in the Mongolian-speaking regions of China. He is forbidding the speaking of Tibetan in Tibetan elementary schools in Tibet, which for millennia was an independent country. He is forbidding the Uyghur Muslims not only from practicing their faith, but from speaking their language. He's taken hundreds of thousands of Uyghur children away from their parents and put them in state-run schools taught by Chinese, Han Chinese teachers, disconnecting them from their culture, their religion, their history. This is an assault on all ideologies outside of the communist ideology, which is called socialism with Chinese characteristics, that is propagated by the party. It's an attempt to unify all of the people living within the borders of China behind the party itself and solidify its rule for a long time to come.
Well, that's a very stark picture and a very concerning picture that you are narrating to us. We wonder, of course, is the West and China, is it inevitable that we will come into conflict? We thought that maybe this religious battle for 50 years of the underground church and the patriotic church could somehow perhaps be resolved. You're telling us that you don't have real hope in it. And so you're depicting China as a very ideological, structured enemy, really, of democratic and human freedom. And I do feel terrible about the events in Tibet, the Uyghurs that you're referring to in the far west of China. These people are being persecuted, and the Tibetans always were a separate country, and they're being absorbed into China, and they're sending all sorts of Han Chinese immigrants into Tibet to take over the country. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's quite deliberate. It's conquest by immigration, which may sound familiar to some Americans looking at our own broken southern border, although the process is not that far along. But going back to one of your early points, Bob, and this concerns the opening that Nixon made to China. And that is that many of us, including me in the 1980s, were hopeful that that the opening to China, which allowed trillions of dollars in U.S. investment to flow into China, which allowed um, free travel back and forth between China and the United States, we were hoping that all of those hundreds of thousands of businessmen carrying briefcases would also help to spark and promote democratic ideas within China. That economic development would lead to political liberalization, that economic development would lead to the creation of a middle class, which would then begin to demand in China some loosening of the regulations, some respect for freedom of speech, freedom of association, assembly, and so forth, which are, by the way, guaranteed in the Chinese constitution. Not that it's ever practiced, but at least it's there in writing. We were hopeful that economic development would lead to gradual democratization, peaceful evolution into a democratic regime. That hope died on Tiananmen Square on June 4th of 1989, when the regime, on the direct orders of Deng Xiaoping, killed 10,000 or so unarmed students and workers in the streets of Beijing.
Is that really the figure? Because there's a debate. Some think it was just a handful. There's many. When you say 10,000, do you really think that's the number that died?
I actually think the number is greater because in the days following the massacre, all of the wounded were taken to local clinics and hospitals in Beijing. Several days after the massacre, army trucks pulled up in front of all of the hospitals and clinics in and around the city of Beijing and took the wounded out of the hospital to camps, and they never reappeared. And there would have been more wounded than those actually killed. I was sent, as it happened, by the Reader's Digest in the days when it still did stories like this, to interview people in Hong Kong and in Paris and other places who had escaped from China. I actually had one of the Chinese dissidents on the list of people to be captured and executed, living in my home in Southern California for a while. I took her in, my wife and I. So I interviewed a lot of the people about the massacre, and the Chinese Communist Party claims that no one was killed in Tiananmen Square, which is absurd. The unrest continued for a couple of days, and yeah, I think that 10,000 is probably the most accurate number. And if you add to that the wounded, I mean, you silence the witnesses, right? The wounded were all witnesses. They were eliminated as well. So I think this was a tragic event. It's one that when George Herbert Walker Bush called Deng Xiaoping and said to his quote unquote old friend, "How could this tragedy have happened?" Deng Xiaoping wouldn't take his phone call because Deng Xiaoping had given the orders to the People's Liberation Army. It was all right to shed blood. And by the way, the Beijing garrison refused the orders, and they had to bring in a mostly Mongolian army unit from the border with Mongolia to actually do the killing, because so many of the students and workers were somehow related to the Beijing garrison troops. Anyway, I'm the number is larger. But after that, you see, that was a watershed. After that, the Chinese Communist Party has made sure that no democracy movement could ever really get started in China. It not only arrested the leaders of the then democracy movement in China, it put in place a patriotic education program starting in kindergarten through college that all students have to take, telling them that the party must be obeyed, respected at all costs, and its leaders. And it now has set up a kind of intranet. The Chinese people are living in a high-tech digital dictatorship where the state knows wherever they go, whatever they say online, whatever websites they visit, whatever they buy, whatever they sell, the state knows and uses that to calculate what's called a social credit score, which is really a political credit score. And if you have a high social credit score, you can buy a home or a car with a low interest rate. And if you have a low social credit score, If you can buy a home or car at all, it's at a very high interest rate. You can't fly on a plane in China if you've got a low credit score. You can't take the high-speed rail. There are all kinds of limitations on your life. So this is really the first country to use technology to control its people in this minute fashion.
Yeah, but what we're saying now is that this is a model for when Western countries may come to introduce in the years to come. And that in the books you read, if we go to read your book about the devil in China, we may, if we're in a woke regime, that may be viewed as a negative on our credit score. My score will start to drop from 700 to 600 to 500 to 400. I'll be no longer.
Don't read the Kindle edition. Read a hard copy.
But it is true that this is sort of a rollout. The Chinese did it first, as it were, but it's being rolled out, or could be. Some people are arguing it's being rolled out everywhere.
Well, when you see Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's business partner, say that in many respects he admires the way that China is run. When you see Bill Gates shaking hands, or the head of Apple going to China and shaking hands, I mean, they realize the power of technology. We've seen how that power was deployed in the last election, for example, and it does in many ways mimic what China's doing. Although in China the control is direct over the internet, here the control is through what are called public-private partnerships. But the government strong arms companies. In the case of TikTok, of course, they don't need to strong arm the company because TikTok is basically controlled by the Chinese Communist Party and is a CCP propaganda operation in the United States. So yeah, I think if you want to see what one of America's possible futures is, you look at China's present, and it's a chilling thought.
And that kind of brings us to the present political situation. In less than 2 months, we here in the United States, we're facing a pretty pivotal election. I think we can all agree on that. And I have a slide in this regard because, as Steve knows, apparently the Democratic vice presidential nominee candidate Tim Walz is quite a big fan of communist China. I came across this article the other day. The headline says, Walz praised Chinese communism as system where, quote, everyone shares. This was published on August 19th. The first couple paragraphs say, as a high school teacher in the 1990s, Democratic vice presidential candidate and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz appeared to extol life under Chinese communism, telling his students that it is a system in which, quote, everyone shares and gets free food and housing. I know Steve's going to comment on that in a moment. He's also quoted as saying, it means that everyone is the same and everyone shares, Walz said during a lesson on China's communist system in November 1991. And this was all published at the time in a Nebraska newspaper, the Alliance Times Herald. Walz is also quoted as saying, the doctor and the construction worker make the same. The Chinese government and the place they work for provide housing and 14 kilograms or about 30 pounds of rice per month. How generous. They get food and housing, he said. So I'm sure Steve has a lot to say in response to all of that.
Well, I do. Look, when Tim Walz went to China for the first time, right after the Tiananmen massacre, remember that was the time when people were fleeing China. That was the time when American businesses were reconsidering whether or not they wanted to continue to invest in China, because the Chinese Communist Party had taken off the mask and revealed its true face, its brutal face, as it turned out. And many of those, all like myself, who were hopeful about China's future, now took a much more pessimistic view. That's precisely the time when this American teacher went to China and spent a year teaching English in a southern China university. Now, I will tell you what happens when you get to China, because this is what happened to me. Tim Walz and I have this in common. We both speak Chinese. We both spent a lot of time in China. And we were both treated the same way when we arrived. We were wined and dined and subject to to countless banquets where overweight officials did their best to pack on another couple of pounds, where a table of officials, 10 or so, would toast you one at a time with Mao Tai until they would get you half looped. And of course, they believe, as the ancient Romans did, in vino veritas. So they would try to find out what you were really thinking about China, and they would try to influence you. The difference between Tim Walsh and I was that I knew not to say ganbei, which means bottoms up. I knew to say sui, which means let's take a sip. And so I got done with the meetings and the banquets and so forth, and got to my village, my commune. And I spent the next year talking to ordinary people, not Communist Party members. Tim Walsh, however, was at a university, and I know that he was put in charge of the university party committee, who would treat him like a visiting dignitary. And he said, I never received so many gifts as I did in China. I got so many gifts I couldn't bring them back with me. There were too many. Well, why were they whining and dining him? First of all, they wanted to turn him into a friend of China. And they did, because a lot of former friends of China after the Tiananmen massacre said, we're done, we're not going to defend you anymore. And they told him all these fairy tales about how wonderful life was under communism. And because he was talking only to Communist Party members and leaders, he did not get a true picture of what life was like in China. I did. So when he says things like, communism means that everyone is the same and everyone shares, he doesn't realize that he was talking to members of the party, which rides on the backs of the Chinese people and exploits their wealth and their ingenuity and their business acumen to become even wealthier themselves. The Chinese Communist Party takes roughly a third of all the wealth of China. In part, that's by corruption, in part because it's the people of China who fund these banquets, who fund the party's salaries, who build the party's housing, who build the party's resorts, who fund the party's foreign junkets. All of that is extracted from the Chinese people. You might think of the Chinese Communist Party as one big exploitation machine. That's certainly how the villagers that I lived among thought of the Chinese Communist Party, because they called it the big landlord. Well, landlord in China is supposed to be a term of opprobrium, right? The Chinese Communist Party accused landlords of exploiting the peasants, and it killed 10 million landlords and rich peasants during the land reform because landlords are bad, right? So to have ordinary Chinese telling me, and many did, that the party is the big landlord was saying an awful lot. People in China, rural China, do not get free food and free housing. If you're a member of the party, you do. But if you're an ordinary Chinese citizen living in the countryside, you have to build your own homes. You have to grow your own food. And by the way, the one time that the Chinese Communist Party did promise to provide free food to people in the countryside, which is where most of the people in China lived in the 70s, 80s, even today, guess what? They said, join the commune system and you can eat as much as you want in the commune kitchens. You won't have to cook in your own kitchens anymore. We will give you free food. Well, that was in 1958. The free food ran out beginning in 1959, and 45 million people starved to death. There are entire villages in China that no longer exist because every living soul died. So much for free food. And as far as the housing, look, today we have, even today, we have communist officials going into villages near the towns or cities that they control and expropriating the land, destroying the housing, bulldozing the housing, and then building an apartment building and telling the former owners of the land whose homes have been destroyed, you can live in my new apartment building, but now you have to pay me rent. That is why the Chinese real estate market is so overbuilt, is because Chinese Communist Party officials have been stealing the land from people for the last few decades. And finally, Tim Walsh said something that wasn't in this article, but I found out later. He said that that the one-child policy was necessary because China has a large population, and if you violate the one-child policy, you only have to pay a fine. No, you don't. If you violate the one-child policy, you will be arrested for the crime of being pregnant. You will be taken in and forcibly aborted and sterilized. I know I was an eyewitness to women in my commune being arrested for the crime of being pregnant, taken and locked up, and then at the end of the day taken to the local clinic and aborted by Red Army doctors of their babies, who in some cases were unborn children 7, 8, and 9 months gestation. There were cases where babies were killed at birth. Illegal children were not allowed to live under the one-child policy. Now, thank God it ended in 2016. But to say that all you had to do was pay a fine is nonsense. He should have known better, and he didn't.
Well, Steve, what we have here is a real question. This man is running for vice president. He was chosen by Kamala Harris. He's visited China, I don't know how many times, but at least 15 or 20 times. He spent a whole year, but he kept going back.
Yeah.
We don't know all of his connections with China, but we know that he did say that you only got a fine, and you just told us that that's the idea of a man who's been sort of brainwashed to believe the best and to only believe the best. What would it mean for the United States to elect a vice president who'd be near to being president, who is such a supporter of communist China?
Well, he's not merely an ideological supporter of communist China. Actually, money has changed hands. And when I say that, I mean that his 30 trips, he took 30 trips to China, taking groups of American students to China from Western Nebraska and later from Minnesota. And on those trips, because he said, I had a friend in the Chinese foreign ministry, all of the expenses, the housing and food expenses, when they got to China were paid for by the Chinese government. So these were propaganda tours that Tim Walz organized and took probably over the course of 30 trips, many hundreds of American students to China. He told them, when you get to China, don't be American, don't talk about America, just listen and learn. So these were propaganda tours paid for in large part by the Chinese Communist Party. And since when he was elected to Congress, and since he's been governor of Minnesota, he's had very close relationships with the Chinese American associations in Minnesota, in Minneapolis and elsewhere. He's gone to their events. He's been celebrated at their events. He's actually spoken at their events, encouraging close relations between China and the United States. He has also served on the Congressional Commission on China, at which he has argued against all evidence that China is not an adversary. We should not treat China as an adversary. Well, I believe we should treat China as an adversary because in 2019, Xi Jinping declared that it was in a people's war, quote unquote, with the United States. I believe that China is an adversary because it's carrying out a huge propaganda operation in the United States, setting up Confucius institutes on college campuses, publishing the China Daily in major American cities. There are newspaper boxes everywhere, propaganda outlets, setting up Chinese American associations all over the country, which are run by and report to the local Chinese consulate or the embassy if they're close to Washington, D.C. They're sending people across the southern border. How do I know that? I know that because you can't get out of China without the permission of the Chinese Communist Party. You have to apply for a visa, an exit visa, but before that, you have to get a passport. And they look at your social credit score. We talked about the social credit score, Bob. If your social credit score is too low, you cannot get a passport and an exit visa. And then you fly to Central America and you head north. The people who arrive in Central America can still access their bank accounts in China. If the Chinese Communist Party did not want them to be traveling north to the American border, they would cut off access to the bank accounts. They can still access social media accounts that tell them exactly where to go across the border, what is the most convenient border crossing on the day that they'll be crossing. And it tells them one more thing. It tells them that if they happen to lose their IDs, and they all do, They all lose their identification papers as they cross the border. They can go to the local Chinese consulate and they will be issued new identification papers, new IDs. Now, we've asked China who they are. We have retinal scans, we have fingerprints, we have face recognition technology. We asked China who these people are because China knows exactly who they are, but China won't tell us. Now, many of these are economic migrants, but the numbers now are in the hundreds of thousands. And I guarantee you that among this wave of Chinese economic migrants, all of whom have pretty good social credit scores, so they wouldn't be allowed out of the country in the first place, there are certainly potential spies, saboteurs, terrorists, you name it. The Chinese Communist Party would be foolish if it did not if it did not implant a certain number of these agents within this massive population that it's allowing to come to Central America, to Mexico, and cross the open, porous southern border. So regard China as an adversary. What about fentanyl, killing almost 100,000 Americans each year? Fentanyl precursors are all produced in China. They are sent to labs in Mexico and some in British Columbia for the final chemical addition that makes it from precursor fentanyl to fentanyl itself. China could shut down the fentanyl production overnight. It doesn't. It subsidizes it. It is killing Americans quite deliberately. So don't tell me, Tim Walz, that China is not an adversary. It has been for a long time, and it will continue to be.
Well,
and then we haven't even gotten to the issue of the pandemic stuff, which this is another excellent book by Stephen Mosher, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Pandemics. If you want to give a brief description maybe of this book, Steve.
Well, I mean, the brief description is I was one of the first people in February of 2020 to say it came from the Wuhan lab. I wrote an article in the New York Post listing the various bits of evidence that all pointed to a lab origin and a deliberate release upon the world. I was banned from Facebook. I'm still banned from Facebook because Mark Zuckerberg was taking instruction from the U.S. government, well, from Anthony Fauci, with whom he'd had conversations, saying that people like me, pointing to the Wuhan lab, were conspiracy theorists. Well, Fauci, of course, was funding the Wuhan lab and wanted to make sure that we were paying attention to bats in caves 1,000 miles away, or to little scaly animals called pangolins. Anybody, look somewhere else. Don't look at the lab, because he funded the lab. He trained the scientists who were doing the genetic engineering that created the COVID virus in the first place. And he should be held accountable. Hopefully he will be after the November election and the January 2025 installation of the man that I believe is the greatest president in my lifetime.
Okay. Do you see anything happening with the BRICS meeting on October 22nd coming up in Kazan, Russia, where they're supposedly going to discuss introducing a gold-backed currency?
Yeah, I'm actually, as an economic practice, I think that having a currency backed by real metals, silver and gold, is a good idea. But this is an effort to undermine the U.S. dollar, which is the reserve currency around the world, and thus to weaken the United States and our economic clout.
Maybe could you briefly just explain what is BRICS for those who may not know?
Well, BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China. A number of countries around the world would like to set up an alternative monetary system to the existing system, which was set up after World War II at the Bretton Woods conference. What having the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency does is it gives us enormous control over international transactions and reinforces the stability of the U.S. dollar, because there is almost as much money in circulation overseas in U.S. dollars as there is in the United States itself. And some countries like Ecuador actually use the U.S. dollar as their own currency rather than printing their own.
Right.
China is determined to undermine the U.S. dollar dominance by establishing a basket of currencies. And I do think that that saying we're going to the gold standard is really misleading, because I think what they want is a basket of currencies, which would include the renminbi, which would include some other currencies, and they would segue from that into renminbi only trades. Now, renminbi is a controlled currency. The Chinese Communist Party central bank sets the exchange rate for that. The U.S. dollar is a free floating currency reflecting market conditions. You cannot give a country like China, under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, control using a controlled currency over international trade. That would give them enormous economic leverage. And I will say that Donald Trump just enunciated at a speech the best answer to this threat, and it was to say that any country that abandoned the use of the U.S. dollar in trade would find that all of its goods, imports and exports, would be subject to 100% tariff. That's pretty much a disincentive to anyone going in the direction of using the renminbi, the Chinese yuan, as the currency of choice.
Well, we're getting near the end of our program. I guess we want a prediction or a kind of view of the future here. We've got the Vatican trying desperately to make an agreement with China. We've got a vice presidential candidate who's entirely in favor of China. We have American candidate Donald Trump, very critical of the excesses of this Chinese regime and this attempt to overthrow the dollar. But how is this all going to develop? Is it a very dangerous moment for us? What do you see in your crystal ball?
I'm going to put up this last image that I think we're going to talk about, a kind of a providential thing that happened over the weekend here. So, as some of our viewers probably know, Donald Trump tweeted out or posted on several social media platforms, "Happy birthday, Mary," with an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, who happens to be the patroness of the Americas and also of the unborn, because she is actually pregnant. That's what the black ribbon around her hands signifies. And it's very providential, whatever his intentions behind doing that. It's interesting to note that he did this in the midst of a 9-month novena to Our Lady of Guadalupe that Cardinal Raymond Burke launched back in March. And this prayer on the right side of the screen was recently released by Father Chad Ripperger. We're going to be interviewing him next week. So ultimately, I think Steve would certainly agree, this is a spiritual battle. We're not battling merely against flesh and blood, but against powers and principalities, ultimately the devil and his minions. So maybe we can end on a spiritual note of how all of this is shaping up.
Well, I think the battle between good and evil has perhaps never been as clear as it is in today's America. I think that in 2 months, we will be voting not just in a presidential election, but on whether or not the United States will continue to be a constitutional republic and one that protects life and liberty and allows people to pursue happiness, which hopefully for everyone is finding their way to God and home to heaven, which was the original meaning, by the way, of the pursuit of happiness, was to pursue God's will in your life. That's what the founders meant by that phrase. And I do think that we see evil so very clearly on display in China, and we see that communism, in my view, is diabolically inspired atheistic philosophy that promotes death. Communism always leads to death. It always leads to going down the socialist road to ruin. Sometimes it kills slowly, sometimes it kills quickly. In China, it's killed hundreds of millions of people, both born and unborn. 400 million in the one-child policy and 100 million in various famines, purges, persecutions. And so the alternative to constitutional rule based on God-given principles is really horrible to contemplate. And it's also deeply disturbing that we now have I think two candidates on the Democrat ticket who are ideologically committed to this view that they can use the government to achieve whatever end they choose, unguarded by, unchecked by morals, unchecked by the Constitution. I don't think we've ever had that in human history. Joe Biden is a transactional politician. The family got money from China. He did favors from China. I think that someone who's ideologically committed to China, and I would include not just Tim Walz, but Kamala Harris in that declaration, in that description, are much more dangerous because of the ideological commitment. It's not just the funding; it's an ideological commitment to that kind of rule. And I would say that when I was at Stanford many years ago, Kamala Harris's father was a Marxist professor in the economics department.
Hmm.
So she's what we call a red diaper baby. Um, Tim Walz, of course, was experienced his conversion in China, as it were, away from the Catholic faith. He was raised Catholic, to kind of this blind admiration of communism. So yeah, this is. I think everything is on the line, and we need to pray as hard as we can, and ask for the intercession of the Blessed Mother, and work as hard as we can for the next 60 days to save the republic.
Amen.
Mm-hmm.
Do
Well,
you
thank you.
think?
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think we will succeed?
I pray that we will succeed. I think that the more Americans need to have their eyes opened to the reality of the fate that we're facing. And I wrote "The Devil in Communist China" precisely because so many young people have been miseducated into thinking that socialism is actually not that bad, and that communism really has never really been tried, so that you can ignore Venezuela, Cuba, Vietnam, China, because this time they're going to get it right. Well, they never will, because communism contains the seeds of its own destruction. What emerges from the boiling cauldron of factional warfare within the upper reaches of any communist party are dictators, are monsters like Chairman Mao and Xi Jinping. That always has been the case, and I'm afraid it always will be. And so, anyone who has children or grandchildren who may be leaning socialist, they need to read what this actually amounts to when it's put in practice.
Get them a copy of this for Christmas. That's
All
my
right.
suggestion.
All right. Well, we were wide-ranging conversation, very, very helpful because you've been a personal scholar, a personal visiting China, and you've helped people who live there, who faced problems with having their children under the one-child policy. So very grateful to you to share your knowledge. Matt, we're going to wrap this up by saying what else do we have to do?
Yeah, so one other thing I wanted to mention, we forgot to mention that Steve is the longtime president of the Population Research Institute. I wanted to put the homepage up there so people know where to find Steve. And providentially, the Inside the Vatican U.S. office and the PRI U.S. office are in the same vicinity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Front Royal, Virginia. So the website, in order to find it, it's pop.org. And then also to find his book, I'll put that up on the screen one more time just so people can find that. The Devil in Communist China, available from Tan Books. I'm getting it up on the screen here. And we, of course, encourage people to check that out, tanbooks.com. If you've enjoyed the show today, please do give us a thumbs up. That lets YouTube know that it's a good video, and please share it on your social media accounts on Facebook or X, wherever you hang out online. Please subscribe to our channel, the Urbi et Orbi Communications channel, and I'm sure Population Research Institute is also on YouTube. I know you're on Facebook as well, so you can find them there. Thank you again, Steve, for coming on. It's really been a great discussion today, and hopefully we can do it again in the future.
I look forward to it. God bless you all.
God bless you, and we'll see you next time.
Come with us on a unique pilgrimage and retreat to renew your spirit. Experience the beauty and richness of southern Spain. Our retreat master, Father Charles T. Murr, a renowned Catholic priest, best-selling author, philosopher, theologian, trained psychologist, and pastor of souls. Father Murr will guide us through 3 mornings of spiritual reflections at a convent located in the historic heart of Carmona, Spain, promising a transformative journey. Experience an intimate evening with Father Murr at his home. Wine, dinner, music, and conversation, a highlight of this unique experience. Explore picturesque towns in Andalusia, each with its own history and charm. From the ancient streets of Carmona to the majestic beauty of Cordoba, the breathtaking views of Ronda, the remarkable village of Centenil, and the historic wonders of Seville. Our pilgrimage will be filled with awe-inspiring moments. Join us on this profound spiritual journey and rediscover the joy of faith, fellowship, and renewal. Book your place now and embark on a pilgrimage and retreat unlike any other.